So for the prompt, it's select a type of crisis situation and how would this crisis affect the family system. So right now I think that a hurricane would be a great example since we're seeing a lot of those. So if a family was affected by a hurricane or going to be affected by a hurricane, um, it would cause a lot of traumatic, um, it would be a traumatic crisis and cause stress and trauma in the family. And so it would affect the family system because it would kind of put them in this maybe whirlwind situation if they were having to evacuate. You have to leave your house and all your belongings behind. You have to begin to kind of select your basic needs and necessities that can fit in the car, and you might have to leave like sentimental items behind, which can be very upsetting, especially if the loved one is no longer with you. Um, it can affect the roles of the family. Um, Kids might kind of have to step up and take a more responsible role to help their parents protect the house, get the house ready. And it kind of just puts you in that crisis mode of um, you just kind of have to pick what's important and what's not, maybe, and move forward. It's kind of hard to say how a crisis would affect the family system because it affects everyone differently, and different types of crisis affect everyone differently. So, how one family may react to a hurricane may be totally different. The number of times that they've maybe been in something like this would also affect how they react. So, those are other things to keep in mind. But the next question is to provide specific examples. I think I just did that. And then, how will the family be affected in the key concept areas discussed? So, the stress, um, the Jackson Cherry text kind of defines stress, and it talks about how it can affect the immune system and make you sick. It affects your energy, um, and how sometimes in stress you have to create boundaries and roles and beliefs. So, I mean, like we talked about the roles for stress the family might take on, like the mother and father might take on a very different role because they're leaving their house behind, they're leaving things that they financially invested in, and they're just thinking long term, how are we going to recover from this? Like, if we lose our jobs because our job is affected by this hurricane, how are we going to pay for this house? How are we going to start over and afford all these things that we have? Things like that. The text discusses how distress is normally negative and eustress is positive, and that if you stay in distress long enough, it can have biological effects on you. It also kind of gives examples and the difference between stress and crisis, which I think is important. And it kind of says that stress is more of a long term. Um, so the stress of the family might be how they're going to recover from this hurricane. How are they going to put these pieces back together? How are they going to start over um, on things for their children plus themselves? And then crisis is more short term. So the crisis would be actually being hit by the hurricane and their house being destroyed and evacuating in plenty of time. That's a short term issue. We then move on to trauma. Trauma threatens the safety and security. So, the trauma in a hurricane situation may be if they didn't evacuate and they chose to stay there and ride the storm out. That affects and threatens their safety and the security of them. Or if they didn't leave an ample amount of time and they were still caught in the storm. Um, Trauma is defined by a traumatic event involves threatened, or if there's a threatened event or an actual death or a scenario of injury that threatens the well-being of someone or another person. This can be human accidents or catastrophes, um, which fits into our hurricane scenario. And then we talk about like the responsive trauma, the intense feeling or fear of helplessness. Um, if the family return back to their home and their home is completely wiped away, gone, or flooded, and every single thing is ruined, um, that can really affect how they're going to look at things long term. They could have psychological disturbance um, in their physical behaviors, cognitive behaviors, emotions, and spirit will all be kind of affected by this. And whenever you respond to trauma, you do it in many different ways. You can kind of have that fight, flight, or freeze. So you can go into that fight mode where you're just in survival mode. The flight where you take charge and start delegating, or you just kind of freeze. And so with this hurricane example, I feel like members of the family could do many different things. The younger children would probably be in that freeze state because they've never experienced something like this before, or the parents might be in that fight for survival to get their family out of that situation. Coping with a situation like this can affect your behavior and your cognitive actions. It can affect how you manage your stress and the progress of your stress. There's two types of coping. There's problem focused, which is behavior related, and then there's emotional, which is coping, and that's where the situation really is like you're not changing the situation necessarily, you're just changing your emotions to it, which then leads to adapting to how you cope with this. And some people may turn to addiction or substance because of like the nightmares that they have because of this event, the fears that they have. That's how they have coped with it, by using things to kind of blur out that scenario. Their families could thrive and become resourceful, and they could learn how to deal with those stressors. And then healthy coping skills leads to less stress. So they could lean on family members, church members, go to support groups to learn how to kind of fix that fear of always being scared that a storm is going to destroy everything that they own. And then your resilience is the long term of how you continue to cope and adapt with all this stuff. If you're resilient, you just continue to strive forward. And if you're not, then you normally fail and you kind of go into that addictive substance abuse kind of coping to kind of mask the pain. So.